thinking I'm younger than I am. It's very, very flattering introduction. The title is slightly changed. I still will talk about Kerouac and Hemingway, although whenever I do that, I feel I have to warn people that I'm kind of harsh on them. So, people tend to love those two and get very mad when I fail to reciprocate. So just be forewarned about that when we get there. But I want to begin with the epigraph here from Samuel Chase, a writer, kind of popular travel writer, who wrote a bestseller called Mexico, A Study of Two Americas. And he asked the rhetorical question, does Tepoztlan have more fun than Middletown? In reference to the famous 1929 ethnography by the Linds, of pioneering sociologists Robert and Helen Lind, which was called Middletown, A Study in American Culture, about Muncie, Indiana. Kind of seeing Middletown as a sort of metonym for Muncie, and also more broadly for America's cultural ills, for conformity, propriety, a kind of Protestant dullness, a declining communal life. So for Samuel Chase, Mexico had kind of defied those trends, preserving local cultures, local economies, traditional skills, communal traditions, agrarian economies, and so forth. Whereas in the United States, these kind of things had withered under the pressure of industrial capitalism and what was often called machine culture by people like Chase. So in Tepoztlan, which is a kind of village in the mountains about an hour now by drive from Mexico City, Chase says that he has this kind of long litany of things that he describes. He never saw a belligerent Mexican drunk. He never saw an impolite Mexican child. He never saw a Mexican housewife who preserved mass-produced cornmeal to hand-ground cornmeal. And in addition, he never saw a Mexican without his hat on, which is something he elaborates on at kind of great length. Unlike American men, he says, who had started to go hatless to preserve their hair, Mexicans never sacrificed propriety for vanity in that way. And they were right to do so, he adds, because he never saw a bald Indian. So you may be wondering, at this last point, you may be asking yourself the obvious question. If they always wore hats, how did he know if they were bald or not? And the point is a kind of tautology. But it indicates a deeper tautology at work in a lot of the work I'm going to be talking about, some of the major modernist engagements with Latin America in this broad period, which is a kind of style of circular reasoning about the innate cultural attributes of the foreign that inevitably sort of is done in the service of a foregone conclusion about your own home culture. The United States is a machine culture, alienated, withering under these kinds of industrial pressures, and therefore we go to Mexico to just confirm that thesis by saying the opposite. Willa Cather wrote in a similarly kind of circular way in her 1927 novel Death Comes for the Archbishop, which is about the early years of New Mexico territory, before its conquest and gradual absorption into the United States for Mexico. And this is a kind of famous line about which much has been written, which we can talk about. I don't have time today to kind of get into the debate about this sentence, but it also kind of conforms to the structure of a tautology. The Mexicans were always Mexicans. Her archbishop, the archbishop she's writing about, is a kind of missionary from France who's reflecting on the history of the territory. He says the Mexicans were always Mexicans and the Indians were always Indians. So like Chase's sombreros and non-bald Indians, Cather's tautology affirms an ontological truth for which no proof is possible. Mexicans were always Indians. There's no sort of way out of that circular logic. And then, well, this was supposed to go in a different order, so my PowerPoint animation skills are not what I thought they were. But beginning with Lawrence Ferlinghetti, the beat poet from a much later time, 1970, his volume Mexican Night. And I am what I am, and I will be what I will be. Sobre las playas perdidas del sur, so on the lost beaches of the South, in the global South sense. So Ferlinghetti is affirming here that it's only in Mexico and in the language of Mexico where he is able to comprehend that he is, in fact, what he is. The South provides both a sense of clarity, the ability to see things as they really are, and also a sense of opacity, the realization that those things, once you see them, are actually impossible to really see. They're always escaping you. So it's again where the circular logic both confirms something you really already want to know, or really already know, but it also escapes you at the same time, and then circles back to you again. The tautological structure of these kind of conclusions justifies the voyage south. Only in Mexico could he come to the realization that he needed to be in Mexico, a point which is made repeatedly by Sal and Dean, the two heroes of On the Road, when they cross the Texas border into Mexico in 1957, in the 1957 novel. And the novel is famous for a lot of things, but in the part I'm going to be talking about, it's the way in which it captures a kind of post-war bohemian fantasy of Mexico as a place of license, of sexual license in particular, and also of a kind of mysterious cultural, well, you might say backwardness, but what Kerouac clearly thinks as a place of romance, where sort of time has stopped, and Mexican history can, or humanities history can be experienced in the flesh. And the arrival scene is, again, tautological. When the two men cross the border, he says, just across the street Mexico began. We looked with wonder. To our amazement, it looked just like Mexico. So, as Walter was kindly telling you, my book, this is an excerpt from this book project that's just finished now, called A Cultural History of Underdevelopment. And in the book I explore how Americans have mapped the hemisphere in terms of a geography of poverty and wealth, or backwardness and advancement, to use a kind of older vocabulary, or underdevelopment and development, to use a more up-to-date, more contemporary vocabulary. But in which, in all of these kinds of terminology, the United States is a rich nation surrounded by poor nations. And so one of the things I'm exploring is like the history of that sort of fiction that a nation unit can be assessed as either poor or rich, as opposed to being what we kind of, in other contexts, know them all to be, a combination of the two, divided unevenly between rich regions and provincial ones, between cores and peripheries and so forth. And one of the major arguments of the book is that these kind of more contemporary terms, underdevelopment and development, which seem to be empirical social scientific or economic categories of analysis, recapitulate older, more explicitly culturalist and more explicitly imperialist forms of national difference that we think of as more cultural or racial in nature. So, when we think of underdeveloped and developed nations, there's a kind of imagination there, a fantasy there, in which the boundary between Laredo and northern Mexico that Sal and Dean cross is actually a clear and explicit boundary between wealth and poverty, between an up-to-date infrastructure and a vibrant, participatory, democratic culture, and the opposite. Where, if we think about it for 5 seconds, we know that that's false. We know that, in fact, the border is a sign of the mixture of these things, and of a kind of failure to be able to make clear distinctions rather than the ability to do so. But the way our vocabulary for describing wealth and poverty in a kind of regional and broadly hemispheric way obscures that that truth, which from a cultural studies perspective is kind of more self-evident. So part of how this relates to my talk today about tautology is that for Kerouac, Mexico is a culturally alien place, but also a place that resides in the past, a place where the Indian fathers of mankind still live, as he says. And so development thinking, the way I described it, is a construction, to go back to the tautology thing, is a construction of self that emerges out of a construction of the underdeveloped other. Construction of a kind of modern, democratic, advanced self that emerges out of an encounter with the underdeveloped other. And in the structure of the tautology, looking at the other just immediately circles back to yourself. So focusing, as I'm doing here, on this kind of syntactical feature, the tautology, is kind of an approach inspired by other famous critics of development and developmentalism. Like in the 1970s strand of Marxist economics called dependency theory, Walter Rodney, one of its most famous exponents, in his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, took aim at the idea of underdevelopment by turning it into a transitive verb, by saying that it's not a condition or a passive kind of lack of integration into the modern capitalist economy, but it's actually the kind of logical consequence of being integrated into the modern capitalist economy. So underdevelopment doesn't just happen, it's done to you. So, I mean, he makes that argument in much more rigorous historical terms, but he arrives at it in this kind of clever grammatical reversal. And Michael Cohen and Robert Shenton, who are two more recent critics, call development a utilitarian tautology, in which development as a means and a process, the process of development, is regularly conflated with development as the objective of the process. And we use the terms kind of interchangeably and without kind of distinguishing between them. So a country undergoes development in order to reach development. Which kind of raises the question of whether you could ever arrive there. Whether the process would ever end, or could ever end. And so my talk today emphasizes the modernist tautology that comes from a desire for, rather than an attempt to repair, the underdevelopment of the Latin American other. It's, in a lot of ways, it's a response to an earlier 20th century, 19th century kind of imperialism that scorned the backwardness of the global South and wanted to find in it, this is the sort of hopeful way of reading it, wanted to find in it a kind of cultural wealth that was overlooked by people only attentive to infrastructure or income. But for two of the authors I'll mention, like Kerouac in particular, this desire was explicitly sexualized and intensely self-absorbed, always circling back to the Anglo-American male protagonist's desire for a more authentic masculinity that could only be realized in Mexico or in the Mexican migrant camps of California, where he spends a lot of the early half of the book. In Willa Cather's work from the American Borderlands, the tautological fallacy reveals something else, which is the uselessness of trying to find these kind of impermeable, territorialized, eternal racial and ethnic essences that I think Kerouac is seduced by. For her, just when you have it, just when you think you've reached it, it circles out of your grasp again, something you can never really realize. So there's sort of two ways of looking at this tautology as being something that is seductive but ultimately wrong or illogical, and on the other hand, as something that is seductive and that you just keep repeating over and over again. And so this modernist desire for underdevelopment that all these authors are a part of is part of a tendency that I call Latinophilia in the book, a kind of tendency for, in 20th century in particular, U.S. Literature and culture. So I define Latinophilia as an enthusiasm for Latin America as a revitalizing force for Anglo-American culture. And it proceeds from the idea that Anglo-American culture is in decline in some way, and that Latin America, because of the things that Samuel Chase found there, the communal life, the agrarian traditions, and so forth, can be a way of revitalizing what is decaying. And you can see that to make a topical election day segue, you can see how the paranoia or fear of American decline is not a new thing, but a kind of perennial sort of feature of American cultural politics. You know, making America great again and so on. So Latinophilia articulates a twofold desire for me. First, to break with a putatively imperial past in cultural relations with Latin America. And second, in doing so, to revitalize the United States, perceived to be in decline. And I use it to mean something different from what scholars in a different context would call Orientalism, which refers to, I think which requires a kind of epistemic difference that's more acute between, say, between Western Europe and the global South, Africa and Asia, than actually as pertained in the history of the Americas, where hemispheric consciousness, however sort of mealy-mouthed that often is, and however violated it often is in practice, does have a kind of long history here. And because of the inchoate and porous borders that divide the United States from Latin America, and the shared revolutionary heritage of republics fighting European imperialism, also kind of produces a different sort of relationship and a different set of distinctions between the modern North and the supposedly pre-modern South. So what I'm saying is that Latin America has never been in American culture clearly the nature to our civilization, or obviously the blackness to our whiteness, or obviously the primitive to our modern. It often is framed this way. That's one of the things Kerouac does, but it's not exclusively that, and there's a more sort of ambiguous relationship at work. And looking south, kind of to sum up, Americans tend to see a version of themselves, either a reflection of their most flattering self-impressions, or an image of the uneven development that does reside here, in which we can see reflected back at us outside of our borders more easily than we can often see it locally. Okay, so one of the big scenes of this Latinophilic move that I'm talking about in the 20th century was Mexico, especially after the Mexican Revolution, when it was the site of what Helen Delpar, a scholar of this era, calls the enormous vogue of things Mexican. It's what brought Diego Rivera ultimately to Detroit, that vogue. And there's a wide, as the Rivera example shows, there's a wide political and aesthetic range here. Some of my favorite kind of work from this period is in photography. It comes from the modernist photographers Edward Weston and Paul Strand. This is Edward Weston's circus tent. And the Italian communist actress and photographer Tina Modotti, who often explored what Weston called the unique intensities, his word was intensities, of post-revolutionary Mexico in a cosmopolitan kind of formalist language like you see here. And like you can see here in this pyramid of Teopanzolco, in which he's emphasizing the kind of the forms of the pyramids in a kind of isolation without showing you the entirety of the structure, or without really dwelling on the function of the structure. And then in other cases, they approached this question in a more internationalist, explicitly political language that drew on local cultural forms and objects in an explicitly politicized way. Here's another example of the kind of intense interest in forms, but then here is the internationalist fusion of vocabulary of Marxism and the local objects like the corn and bandolier, and the sombrero of the campesinos, and the, I don't know if you can see it, but they're reading El Machete, which is the Communist Party newspaper. And there's a combination here of this sort of interest in the repetition of forms, of the circular shape of the hats, with the kind of political point in the middle. And then there are folklorists like Francis Torr, who published Mexican Folkways, a magazine produced between 1925 and 1937, which featured the work of a lot of the leading lights of the Mexico City art world, which was then a kind of real world center of avant-garde art. Some of the Mexican leading lights like Rivera and Orozco, and some of the expatriates like Weston, Modotti, and others. So in Mexican folkways, you can get a good example of some of the debates of this period in this community, but also a good sense of the critique of American culture to which Latinophilic intellectuals were responding, what they were making and to which they were responding. So what is wrong with the United States, in short? This is one answer that Frances Torr gives you. She says, think of those glorious and complacently rich United States of America before the crisis, so talking about the Depression, or the stock market crash, when there were full dinner pails, bathtubs, and automobiles for the average worker. For the middle classes, several automobiles, and for the rich, automobiles without limit. But those people with so many material comforts had to go keep radios going when they were not going themselves. People with no calm, no inner peace. And now one of the many problems facing the country is what to do with the leisure forced upon it by the crisis. Thus the sight of the Indians sitting for hours without doing anything and then producing something beautiful seems to them a miracle. So, there's this kind of exoticism, kind of condescension, of course, in that last sentence. A familiar kind of bourgeois bohemian response to alienation, resistance as escape, a desire for individual psychic solutions like inner peace. But she also she was a sort of interesting, complex person. She also excoriated what she called sentimental romantics, kind of tourists, cultural tourists from the United States, who she thought exploited Indian artistry with no sense of any kind of self-critique, no sense of any sense that they were failing in any way themselves, and that failure was driving them to Mexico. So, there's an attempt to grapple with economic failure here as a defining feature of American life rather than as an exception to it. And if American capitalism could no longer be counted on, I think Torr is suggesting, to provide either bread or roses, so either sustenance or cultural life, then she's saying perhaps Latin America, so often dismissed as primitive and backwards, could provide an alternative path. So, but having reached that sort of high note, I'm going to take us down to Kerouac and Hemingway. Two authors whose accounts of Latin America exerted real broad popular influence in the kind of generation after the end of the Mexican Revolution, the end of the Depression, and the war. So, The Old Man and the Sea, which is Hemingway's famous Cuban novel, his most famous Cuban novel, and On the Road. So, what we've seen so far is Latinophilia can vacillate between a kind of cosmopolitan or internationalist identification with Latin America on the one hand, and then a kind of exoticist fetishization of an anachronistic old Mexico that resides in a different world and a different time on the other hand. And in the post-war era, as the Cold War begins, the rise of mass tourism consigns Latin America to the United States' backyard of insurgencies and holiday destinations. This kind of latter impulse starts to predominate. So, as I was saying, machine culture was the buzzword for interwar Latinophiles like Samuel Chase, who asked if Middletown had less fun than Tepoztlan. But post-war alienation in texts like Hemingway's Old Man and the Sea comes from a perception that Americans had left the factory and the fields behind. The symbols of cultural stagnation then were less working class than they were middle class. They were less the machine and more the gray flannel suit, in other words. And so the notion that Americans were anxious and frightened or bureaucratized, turned into organization men, was a commonplace of 50s and 60s cultural critique. Okay, so many people have probably read The Old Man and the Sea at some point. Some others may have seen the Spencer Tracy film. But just to briefly recap, it's the portrait of a Cuban fisherman's battle with a giant marlin that he catches, his biggest catch of his life that he makes out at sea one day. Most early reviewers, though, ignored what would seem, to me anyway, to be an extremely important detail, which was the nationality of the main character. Contemporary reviewers rarely observed that it even took place in Cuba at all, and the few who did mentioned it in passing. Instead, what critics tended to do was to emphasize the old man and the sea, and I think this is still kind of how it's generally interpreted, as a universal sort of parable of tragedy and pride. So despite reviewers' lack of interest in the title character's Cubanness, the appeal of the old man and the sea, I would argue, rests on its careful characterization of its main character, Santiago, and especially its sometimes confusing balance of foreignness and familiarity in the way that he's depicted. His simplicity and his proximity to the natural world, the fact that he spends his days at sea fishing with a kind of extremely primitive fishing apparatus, are what make him, clearly not an American. Yet one is allowed to forget that Santiago is Cuban, on the other hand, at the same time, and so he becomes, for many critics, universal, since, in the United States, to be a universal figure means to be recognizably an American figure. And I'm going to just focus on one example, which is a conversation that they have about baseball in the middle to kind of make this point. Baseball is the cultural currency that's shared by the Cuban character and the U.S. reader, and so it functions as a sort of pivot between the North and South. In the text itself, baseball is also a kind of secular religious motif, an object of Santiago's faith and the bedrock of his kind of sense of justice. So he says, in one of his conversations with the boy, who's only ever named as the boy, his kind of apprentice, "The Yankees cannot lose," he declares, in the sort of stilted, grandiose tone that he always speaks, and that Cubans tend to always speak in Hemingway's writing. His young apprentice, known only as the boy, replies, "But I fear the Indians of Cleveland. Have faith in the Yankees, my son. Think of the great DiMaggio, who is a fisherman, famously the son of a fisherman, and so that's why the old man is so enamored by him. I fear both the Tigers of Detroit and the Indians of Cleveland." I can't read his "Be careful, or you will fear even the Reds of Cincinnati and the White Sox of Chicago." So this is how Hemingway tends to deal with the question of Spanish syntax. And if you've read other Hemingway work, he's famous for kind of unadorned simplicity in dialogue, which this is light years away from, I would say. Instead, it's quite affected, and the affectation is a product of the way that Hemingway always literally renders Spanish syntax. So you would say in Spanish the Los Tigres de Detroit to just say the Detroit Tigers, and he just translates that kind of syntax literally. Also eliminating conjunctions, which don't really exist in Spanish in the same way as in English. So it sounds sort of stiff and almost kind of biblically formal, which lends itself to the way that readers often read The Old Man and the Sea as being this kind of universal kind of parable, sort of almost biblical way. But of course, on the other hand, it's the two Cubans' distance from Yankee Stadium that lends the conversation its great gravity and gives the great DiMaggio this kind of apostolic ideal that he has in the old man's imagination. At one point in the novel, Santiago sees a Miami-bound jet flying over the Florida Straits where he's fishing, and the appearance at the novella's end of U.S. tourists gawking over the ravaged carcass of the Marlin underscores, of course, where Cuba is at the interstices of the developed and underdeveloped world. A place so close and yet so foreign, as a famous tourism poster of the 1950s said about Cuba. But it's the evasion of its character's Cubanness and the mock Spanish syntax and vocabulary all explain why early reviewers read it as universal and messianic rather than kind of specific and historical in its themes. So in making Santiago a universal subject of an existentialist parable, Hemingway projects onto him the pre-modern vitality and piety that an association with nature that presumably Americans used to have but have lost. And at the same time, his devotion to baseball and his ambiguously English speech grounds this universality in the United States. So Santiago becomes a kind of surrogate American onto whom these nostalgic masculine fantasies of rugged survival in the wilderness can be projected. Okay, and then finally there's On the Road, which a book, despite its reputation for being formally innovative and being kind of culturally subversive as a kind of counterculture or bohemian beatnik novel, to me, in the context in which I'm approaching it, in this sort of Latin Americanist context, more closely resembles the Victorian racism of late 19th century travel writers in Latin America than it does a lot of its more recent or more contemporary equivalents. So, when Kerouac describes the basic, primitive, and wailing humanity that stretches in a belt around the equatorial belly of the world from Malaya to India, to the great subcontinent, to Arabia, to Morocco, to the deserts and jungles of Mexico, and so on, so on, and so forth. The Frances Torr, even who described the Indians sitting around doing nothing, would have, as problematic as that description was, she would have, recoiled from this kind of, I think, uncritical exoticization of Mexico. And so, Kerouac's novel is kind of exceptional then in the way it relinquishes even the most sort of minimal level of engagement with Mexico, except as a fantasy. A screen upon which a fantasy of a revitalized consciousness and of a kind of an ancient human history, like you see here with the unmistakable Indians, can be realized. The great Indians who were the source of mankind and the fathers of it, as he says at the bottom of this excerpt. Rachel Adams, as Rachel Adams puts it, the real landscape of their Latin American journey is their own grandiose subjectivity. So they kind of they travel around Mexico without really leaving their own heads, is kind of what she's arguing there. I think she's right about it. At the same time as Saladin's rebellious flight to Mexico takes place, the southern border crossing was becoming more and more porous for American and Mexican trade as well, as the U.S. and Mexican government were aggressively promoting cross-border traffic and foreign direct investment. So, the border crossing that Kerouac describes here in such sort of rapturous terms is actually very conventional at the time that he makes it. When Ferlinghetti, who was Kerouac's contemporary but a sort of political critic of his, goes to Cuba after the 1959 revolution, he has this sort of telling anecdote where he talks to a famous Cuban poet affiliated with the revolution and asks him what he thinks of Kerouac. The Ferlinghetti replies, "Well, I called him before I left to see if he was interested in coming down, and called him in Long Island, like in the Long Island house where he lives." And Kerouac says, "I got my own revolution out here. It's the American Revolution." It's out here means like in his suburban Long Island living room, essentially. And so, On the Road, for that in that sense, the Cuban Revolution sort of interrupts, I think, a lot of this kind of fantastical idealization of Latin American poverty as an example of an eternal history, rather than as an example of a kind of set of economic relationships that were very much of the present. But it also exemplifies a sort of denouement, I think, for the critique and for the desire that I've been tracing here in the literature of Latinophilia, which is that the United States was in the midst of a protracted cultural and spiritual decline. The desire to reverse this decline into monotony and exhaustion was a journey, whether physical or entirely imaginary, into regions of the hemisphere and the psyche not yet conquered by mass culture. But for Kerouac, this is framed in a kind of naive exoticism, which is, fairly obvious when you see it here and fairly easy and crowd-pleasing to criticize. But one of the interesting things about interwar Latinophilia that I want to retain, aside from the way in which this kind of lore of an ideal of American cultural decline is so persistent and so sort of seductive, and so, as we can sort of see very well today, so very dangerous. But some of the best work in this vein, I think does work to compare the United States modernity to Mexico's in a way that kind of reflects critically on the relationship between the two, rather than simply fetishizing the relationship between the two as being ancient or ahistorical. So, by the time Hemingway, though, writes on The Old Man and the Sea, the only thing that Cubans and Americans have in common is this kind of abstract and sort of pretentious notion of a common humanity. Besides baseball, that's all they have in common. And Kerouac's On the Road is the kind of nadir of this movement that I'm talking about, because it abandons even that sort of humanist gesture that motivates Hemingway, and the Latin American landscape becomes just a kind of projection screen for old American fantasies. So thank you for listening. And just two more pretty pictures here. This is a good example of the critique of American culture made by a Mexican muralist, Jose Clemente Orozco, but made in the United States and received very well and very eagerly by a lot of the Latinophilic critics I'm describing. You can see the kind of barren, homogeneous depiction here of New England village life, no longer a kind of vibrant or vital source of American identity, but now it's just this kind of frozen waste. And then a good example of machine culture, the machine totem from the same epic of American civilization, which is at Dartmouth, in the Dartmouth Library. So now we discuss next.
I want to know, what do you mean with the statement, underdeveloped, it's not something that just happened, but it's something that's done to you?
Yeah.
Can you expand on that?
Yeah, so Walter Rodney, when he calls his book How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, he's responding to critics who see underdevelopment as a kind of condition rather than as a product. So the poverty of, say, Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, in a kind of conventional way that Rodney's arguing with would say, well, it's this legacy of their innate poverty, of a kind of village cultures that aren't acclimated to being in the modern economic world, like an excessive religion, lack of secularism, sort of various things, like cultural problems that prevent them from being part of the modern economy.
Social problem.
Yeah. And Rodney's saying that underdevelopment, the poverty of the global south, is a consequence of what he says, the extraction of resources from Africa, is what he's talking about, from Africa during the colonial trade, and the kind of impoverishment of African workers working in those kind of extraction industries, like mining, petroleum, and so on. So he's saying that Europe made Africa underdeveloped through a kind of concerted set of processes, that it wasn't just an accident, but an actual deliberate result. Because the way we say underdevelopment, it sounds like it just sort of happened by accident rather than by design. That's what he's saying.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Barry.
Thanks for your talk. I'm going to take up Kerouac's defense a little if I'm so bold. You ended by saying, and again, I think what you're saying for the most part is correct. I just feel like there's a bit more subtlety going on. I think it's easy, Kerouac especially, it's easy to kick that horse as it lays on the ground. It's like pretty clearly, problematic by our standards today of what he was doing, so I understand that. You ended by saying this idea of the projection screen for all American fantasies you said about Kerouac. It's a little bit, I'm going to kind of challenge it a bit. I don't think that's totally fair. I mean, you know, old American fantasies about Mexico would be what? Fantasies of imperial conquer, right? And I don't think, I mean, I can see that there's a reading in that in On the Road. I get that. But I think for the most part, you know, I don't think that's exactly what he's doing. And even his own declarations, I mean, he goes down there and says at several points, hey, look, we've been given this sort of stereotype of Mexico. This isn't it. Like, I'm encountering, that's part of, for him, what's sort of redemptive about it, is that he's challenging the ways he's been presenting Mexico to him over the years. So I don't think that's totally fair. The other thing I think that more importantly is there's a lot of other things going on in that novel, and also Tristeza, which, I mean, I'm sure you're probably aware of, his novel of his affair with a Mexican prostitute, where I think there's these moments where I think he kind of gets, I agree, he kind of glosses them over and kind of keeps going with this sort of tautological kind of paradigm, but there's a lot of moments where there's like a rupture, and I think he kind of sees what he's doing. And I think those are probably actually more interesting to talk about, you know, than another cliche. Yeah, there's a lot of cliche kind of stereotypical things that are easy to discuss, but there's a lot, especially along the lines of digging for him, you know, that's tautological as well in a different way, right? I dig this person as them or like them, like it's a simile, right? They're like, that Mexican guy looks like that, our friend in America, but he's in Mexico, you know? And these moments, I think, a lot of times they keep going on that. So it's a way of making Mexico familiar, like as them, but it's still strange. But then that whole system erupts when it kind of breaks down, when they have interactions with the people, with the local people, and it doesn't conform to the way they expect, right? So, I mean, I guess my pitch is, I guess I'm talking to the whole room at this point. My pitch is that, you know, although On the Road, clearly it's got some problems by our standards, and, you know, there's really no getting around that. There's actually quite a lot there, I think, that would complicate, and maybe add to your discussion if it was looked at in a different way.
Well, I mean, so, yeah, I mean, it's a fair critique of the last line that, well, I guess what I'm gesturing back to there is something more, I might defend myself by saying there's more in the book about this that I'm gesturing back to, because I read Kerouac's treatment here of this kind of eternal primitive wailing humanity as being a more pleasurable example of what a lot of 19th century Victorian travelers saw and simply denounced as being sort of disgusting and backward. I mean, he's seeing the same sort of primitiveness. He's seeing the same kind of Indians frozen in time, you know, the unmistakable Indians who are not, and this is where part of what you're gesturing to, I think. They're not the Pedros and Panchos of silly civilized American lore, like the kind of bandito kind of stereotype. So he's taking issue with that recent stereotype, but replacing it with this idea of Mexico as a kind of place outside of and almost kind of before history, which for me gestures back to a much older way of reading it as being frozen in time. But you know, where Victorian travelers would have seen this as being something to fear, whereas Kerouac reads it as something to embrace and something titillating and thrilling and enriching. And so I think, like, for me, the best way of reading it is to read it like what, as I was sort of reading Tor and some of those others, as being reflective of a critique of the United States as being a kind of a place of, during the Cold War, in spiritual and cultural kind of decadence or decline. But he just has no account of the relationship between the United States and Mexico as taking place in a kind of any historical framework. I mean, and again, maybe that's part of what's easy to say now, or a kind of obvious academic's critique of him. But that's still my critique.
Yeah, I mean, it's been said. People have said this, right? I mean, Martinez said that. Many other people have said this. Also, you can quickly follow up on this. Maybe I also kind of got confused. If Kerouac's making the point that this sort of fellahin is his word, right? The Arabic fellahin, he's using this sort of this swath or band across the equator of these peoples. how does that complicate, or does that not complicate your Latinophilia approach? Because he's not saying in Mexico, he's saying he wants to group them amongst this whole sort of type or something of a kind of global peasantry or something like that, using an Arabic word to refer to the particular Mexican people he's encountering. So I'm not so sure how that ties in with your argument. It seems might problematize it.
Well, I would say it only emphasizes his detachment from Mexico as a place that's something other than a personification of fantasies. Because Fellahin is his term in his fantasy, and he sees it in Mexico.
Yeah. What about when these fantasies get disrupted? Do you see that as is that just an off moment we can kind of just let go of, or is this worth pushing? It seems like several places in this account and in other accounts he has in Mexico, he kind of realizes, I think, oh, wait a minute, I'm not, here's this person I'm ascribing this story to, but yet, when I start talking to them or something happens, I realize that story doesn't fit. So then what does that mean about my own storytelling about this person, right? And I think those moments, although he doesn't pick up on it, yeah, it'd be nice if he would have picked up on that and ran with that, but he didn't, unfortunately. But it seems like a kind of a redemptive moment that could provide a way out for him.
Yeah, well, that might reside outside of on the road then, so like from what you're saying.
No, I mean, there's some cases, and digging, I think, is the moment that happens. It happens all throughout the book, but also specifically in Mexico, where they're trying to understand another person. How do you understand the other, right?
Yeah.
Is it just pure other, or do you bring them in? To bring them in, they have to be made familiar. And so they make them familiar by digging them as something or like something else, right? Mm-hmm. Imagine that's like our friend, that's like Hassel, or that's like, this guy, he's the Mexican Hassel or something like that, right? And that seems to be a moment where, that's how they kind of make it work, right, to get closer, but then when they actually they have these moments where they confront these people and it's like, they're different, right? And they push back, obviously, because they're real people, right? And it seems like in that moment, there's actually some work being done that again, Kerouac does not pick up on that, I agree. And that would have been nice to see him kind of, work that out, but he doesn't. But I think there's enough of those moments where he kind of stops the text, that they're weird, disjunctive moments, for me, in my reading.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it always comes back to Dean. I mean, the Mexican landscape or Mexican background is a kind of way for them to sort of the means by which they work out whatever they're working out with each other. But Barrett, did you have?
Oh yeah, I got a couple things. Okay, so one line I want to look at has to do with the ways in which these modernists and postmodernists see Mexico as a kind of, not just a moment of underdevelopment, but a counter-modernity. Yeah. So it's a way of gauging the modernity that we live by a modernity that could be organized in a different way. And I think evidence of that is the sort of split between extreme localism, people live, breathe, experience time differently in Mexico, versus the monumental past, which is often brought immediately into proximity with that. So when you go to the Western photograph of the ruin, seen as a kind of formal thing, what you're looking at is a kind of channeling of an archaic counter-modernity, almost like an Asiatic mode of production or something like that. A notion of a kind of modernity that is not the one that came along with capitalism, but still has the same kinds of cultural achievement and monumentalism that would count as civilization. So that leads to like a split in I think, one aspect of what's going on in this North-South engagement. On the one hand, you could look at the tautological nature of the projective identification of northern cosmopolitans going down and experiencing the South. So whatever they have is what we lack. Okay, so there's a sense that this fullness of culture down there is precisely what we moderns don't have. But you could also see it as a reflection on combined and uneven development as experienced on both sides of the North-South divide, so that the comparative aspect of that engagement is more important than simply the projective one. So I think that that's a tension, and you could go from Hemingway on the one hand to Kerouac on the other and see a slide, from that. So with Old Man of the Sea, in Hemingway's I think your point about the use of language does not capture the fact that Hemingway's trying to interject linguistic and cultural difference into the fabric of his own writing. He does that specifically in For Whom the Bell Tolls, with the Usted kind of parallel to what he's doing with baseball. So you're looking at. I think you're still not granting the possibility that one of the things that Hemingway's interrogating in that is the possibility of cultural translation across these two different experiential locuses, the narrators and the protagonists.
I mean, I don't think he cares about that, though.
Well, I think he does.
He does it in Cuba. No, certainly none of the Cubans did.
I mean, I think that
At least
we could talk about
Cuba
that. I
when he
mean,
was alive.
another way of thinking about universalism is as a third term, not as simply an identification with Americanness. You identify the universalism of the baseball. What about the universalism of the Marlin? The Marlin is a natural fact. It is not assignable to Cuba or America. It is in the sea. What about the sea? Obviously, as a profound register of the universal, doesn't that exceed the question of cultural translation that's going on? So I think that there's more subtlety in the ways in which Hemingway is working questions of difference and using a kind of comparative methodology. And that brings me to the problem of tautology, because basically, I like your notion of tautology, but what you're also saying is cultural nationalism simply recognizes cultural nationalism. You're saying that the projective is tautological with that which it's projecting. And that's a logic that seems consistent across the evidence, right? So I could also say that your notion that Hemingway is a cultural nationalist projecting onto Cuba is the same tautology that you're locating in the evidence, right? You're simply taking it to another level of generality, saying that's the politics. And so I think there's also another way of doing transnationality here, which would look at regional disparities and compare, and alternative modernities as a tension. I'm not saying that you're wrong about the projective, but I'm also saying that there's something about the comparative, and the critical regionalist aspect of this that is happening, at least strongly in modernism. And then you'd have to go to Kerouac and look at Kerouac as a kind of regressive instance of a return to a kind of more phantasmatic form of what counts as projective identification. That's a whole other topic. But I do think that the mythic in Kerouac that Eric's been talking about isn't just like a fantasy of the other. I think it's also an other modernity that aligns with the kind of monumentalism that Weston is also seeing. So that Fellaheen world and the world of the Aztecs, the world of myth, the great, the great counter modernity of the mythic, I think is what Kerouac is trying to evoke there, as he does in Dr. Sachs and a number of other.
There's also the Mayan hieroglyphs that became a huge deal for many people during this time
Yeah,
period.
but those are two different kinds of myths. I mean, it's the myth of one's own self, or a myth of a kind of reinvigorated masculinity versus that, which is a kind of a myth of a kind of the represented achievements of, in this case of like Mesoamerican culture.
Well,
I mean, one is about the self, and one is about like an actual built
mythic reconstruction of pre-modern civilization is all over modernism, right? I mean, modernism's relation to classicism is a kind of mythic reinvestment in something seen as a kind of fragmented and lost past. Looking at HD, for instance, in her use of classical Greece, and I think it's very similar to what's going on in Weston here. It's a fundamental modernist concern.
Yeah, I mean, I know that that's an old story, and it's a story that's been told, but I'm sort of trying to the chronology I'm trying to sketch here, or the association that by which I'm linking these various different figures, has to do with the production of a concept that would come to be called in Hemingway's time underdevelopment. So the ways in which Americans are engaging with the notion of Mexico as a poor country and of the United States as a rich country, and how those two kinds of, what I would say, those two, in a way, sort of fantasies, kind of co-produce each other.
And yet you've got the evidence of modernists who represent Mexico to North America, like Rivera, like Madati, who basically embrace, you know, an urbanism and a, you know, industrialization of the South that is then responded to and approved of by, you know, left modernists. So there's a whole way in which there's a component of American modernism that's substantially informed by a Mexican input that doesn't simply represent Mexico as underdeveloped. Mexico is a modernity, you know, and so when Trotsky goes to Mexico City, he's actually going to a modern city that has a modern class politics that he believes he can interact with, and I think that would, it isn't, so one of the questions would be the relationship of the peasantry as the slow time of the peasantry, which I agree that Kerouac picks up on, as simply representative of Mexico. Mexico by the early 20th century is industrializing in many places. It's urbanizing. It's not, you know, it's an intention with, obviously you know this. So
yeah, I mean, it's
yeah,
there you go. I mean, I mean, I don't talk about it here, but you know, if you want to make this comparison between the modernists who saw in Mexico a kind of modernity that the United States, what you call the counter-modernity, I think there's, I think you're right, and there's a lot of examples of that, and a lot of examples I didn't talk about here. But the other, I mean, in a way, Hemingway's To Have and Have Not is an example of that too, and I counterpose it to The Old Man and the Sea in the longer version of this as a much better way of doing what you say The Old Man and the Sea is doing, of engaging with the kind of historical specificity of Cuba in the 1930s and the United States in the 1930s. I mean, it's a 30s novel that's also sort of critical of 30s novels. Takes place in Key West, kind of right between the two places, and it's a much different, a much, I think, superior way of writing about Cuba than what he does more famously in The Old Man and the Sea. But did you have your hand up a while ago?
I did, but I don't want to take tips. All right, well, I was thinking, I wanted to ask, and I think this is along the lines of what Barry was asking, but from a different discipline. So I'm in political science, and I study Latin American politics, and I was interested in whether in this work or the book, you know, I don't know if they're two separate or one of the piece, how much you get into the parallel with dependency theory, and in particular, I was thinking about the role of core and periphery, and the idea of understanding that, you know, the core is not just the north, the periphery is not just the south, but there are elements of the core in the cities of the global south, and perhaps elements of the periphery and parts of the north. And so I just was wondering how far you took that.
I mean, I'm kind of
parallel. I'm just kind of curious.
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe sort of obvious that I'm, you know, quite inspired by dependency theory, at least some of the kind of primary motivations behind it, which I was talking about with Rodney. And you know, on the same kind of grammatical. I mean, they had a taste for these kinds of grammatical titles, or grammatically subversive titles. So, you know, the development of underdevelopment of Andre Gundefrank being the kind of other example, which is another sort of way of making the same point that Rodney makes, that development is not just a kind of neutral process, but one that is invested with power and profit, and that underdevelopment is a kind of deliberate but also historically expected product of development in a capitalist world system, right? I mean, so I mean, I'm approaching it, I guess, from a different point of view, and with maybe a critical point of view in two ways. I mean, one, as you probably know, a lot of critics of dependency theory have talked about how they tend to treat core and periphery only in global terms, and so the United States is the core, Argentina or Mexico is the periphery, and kind of overlook core core periphery relationships within those places and tend to kind of like solidify nations as wealthy or poor, which is something I'm trying to kind of work against. But of course I'm also approaching it from a sort of cultural studies perspective where I'm talking about underdevelopment as, in some of its kind of orthodox expressions, like especially in the 50s and 60s, as something that's very culturalist and kind of very interested, like in people like Walter Rostow's, work, for example, in diagnosing underdevelopment as a product of sort of cultural features, cultural failings, often. And I'm kind of tracing that back into more explicitly culturalist accounts of poverty that come before the war and come out of the colonial era, which the idea of development and underdevelopment is supposed to be kind of leaving behind those kind of terminologies and those kind of motivations. And I'm sort of talking about how their legacies sort of persist.
Is there a question over there?
Yeah.
So I haven't read your book yet, and I mean,
I can't believe it.
yeah, I'm sorry, but obviously, like as you said, like this fear of American decline is, a big deal today. On the opposite side of the, we should build a wall craziness, there is the fact that Mexico City is like quickly gentrifying. I have relatives in Mexico who, when they describe it to me, it just sounds like San Francisco or Manhattan. So obviously, like there is gentrification going on in Mexico on a really like significant level, and I mean I'm just an example of someone who is doing just what you're talking about in your talk a little bit, which is I'm kind of putting onto Mexico City what I'm putting in my own experiences as like someone from America. So that's my like long way of getting to, are you finding instances of Latinophilia in contemporary American fiction or broader popular culture today?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I think I was motivated or brought to it by, well, like a lot of things in this book actually, I was sort of brought to it in some respects by my own experiences, as well as sort of as like a college age Latinophile, I suppose. Somebody who sort of like for my own sort of politicization or sense of like development of a kind of political awareness or consciousness was so mediated by Latin America, especially Cuba. I mean, that's why I sort of started studying Cuba in college, was a sort of romantic attraction to the Cuban Revolution and to the history of it. So I feel like it's more, and maybe you could actually help me out here with contemporary examples. I feel like it's a more common thing in film, and also in video games. Actually, that's where I kind of encounter it, in like those kind of popular media where there's a more and I won't get into the video games thing too much because Tracy's already shaking her head at me, but I'm trying to think now. I mean, you're catching me off guard, and I can't think of a good filmic example.
I mean, it seems like most contemporary films and TV shows are depicting the negative cartel-obsessed aspect of Mexico.
Babel.
Yeah, right.
Babel.
Is a fabulous example of
Traffic.
the works.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to think about it. I think because I have memories of noting it, but now I'm failing to come up with a good example.
Well, thank you for your talk.
Thanks. I'm gonna email you something when it occurs to me 20 minutes from now.